Okay, welcome everybody to the second night of Argle Bargle Book Bonanza here on YouTubes, and tonight it is myself, Christopher Sperandio, Stan Waney, who's the publisher of Argle Bargle Books, and Brian Huberman, who is the filmmaker responsible for the new documentary about comic artist, comic legend, Jaxon. And I thought I would just give a little bit of background on how all of this sort of came about. A few years ago, I guess maybe 5 now actually, I started the Comic Art Teaching and Study Workshop at Rice University. And this is a hybrid research space and study space on the Rice University campus. And it's inspired by the cartoon library and museum at Ohio State, which I very much admire, which started in kind of similar modest circumstances. So I've been making comics. I'm a professor of art at Rice University, but I also have been teaching comics. One of the things that I've done is I've begun collecting original comic art to use as teaching tools. And I fell into a kind of trove of original Mexican comic art from the 1960s. And I decided that I ended up collecting about 1,400 pieces. And I decided that I would start trying to exhibit these in order really to find, to drive the scholarship on these things, because I think that Mexican comic art is highly overlooked. This series of exhibitions led to the publication of this book, Fundamental Camarena, that was published by Argle Bargle Books and sponsored by the Department of Bioengineering at Rice University, oddly enough. That's another story altogether. The book has some essays about Mexican comic art, and then it also reproduces in facsimile the original art, 92 pages of original art in facsimile. So this is the size of the book. The Mexican comic art is often very small. Just another image from there. And in addition to exhibitions and now this book about Mexican comic artist Julio Camarena, my colleague Brian Huberman from Rice University, every time we would see each other in the hallway, he would tell me about this Jaxon film that he had shot but never edited. And finally, I got fed up with that. I said, tell me more about this thing. And I knew that I was producing this book, and I had already pitched the book idea to Stan. And then I had the idea, like, you know, I think that people would be very interested in a film about Jaxon. And why don't we try to get Brian to finish his film, and we could take the film and the book to Angoulême, which is what we did. This is the poster for the film, and some examples of Jaxon's work. Here's the cinema where we screened it in January. So Stan, Brian, and I went together to Angoulême and promoted the crap out of this film and had a screening. And we invited Gary Groff from Fantagraphics Books, who is a longtime friend of Jaxon, and we did a little panel discussion. We skipped some stones, and we had a good time. Yeah, that's the story. That's the bio. I did that in 4 minutes.
In 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, Brian, you want to take it away?
I can, I guess. I'm just getting used to the format. I guess we won't. Am I on screen?
You are on screen.
Yeah.
I can't tell. I mean, are we always on screen, or does it bounce from each of us as you decide?
So right now it's the three of us
Okay, fine.
together.
I'm for some reason or other, it seems important for me to know what's actually what's actually being seen by anybody. But anyway, yeah. So the Jackson film, that what became the Jackson documentary called Jackson's Rant was actually filmed in 2001. Like so many documentary projects, I met Jaxon, who lived in Austin, Texas. Well, I was engaged in a film about something else, something quite different. And for some strange reason, I thought that maybe he would be able to help me with this other project, that by filming him, some of that material would help. Turned out that that didn't work out, but instead, he was at that time engaged in what would turn out to be his last great work, which was the story of the Alamo told from both the Mexican and the Anglo-American points of view. And he was engaged in that final great creative stage of comic book art, which is inking, or at least for him it was inking. And for a year, I filmed him. Every month I went to his studio in Austin, and for a night I would, because he worked only at night, I would film him inking, and as he inked, he would talk about various things. He was a great narrator.
Raconteur.
Thank you, raconteur. And he would talk about his work. He would talk about the details of the type of comic book production that he was engaged in. He worked with an ink pen, a dip pen, I would call it. And
so let me interrupt you right there. I just want to tell everybody that's watching, both of them, that on my YouTube channel is actually embedded a short 4-minute documentary about Brian and I getting ready to go to France to take his film and my book to Angoulême. And so if you want to see some clips of that film, jump out, watch that 5-minute piece, and then come back. We will not go anywhere, and you will have not missed anything.
Really?
It's a great way to promote the event, Chris.
So I'm sure both people watching appreciate it.
All right.
You know, I think it's good I think that talking about art is boring. Looking at art is slightly better.
Looking at art, it's
slightly better than talking about art.
I tend to agree.
So go away. We'll be here talking about art, and you can go look at art.
Maybe talking about art is boring, but talking about artists can be interesting. And you know, the Jackson documentary, The Rant, is really a portrait of the artist who was, I think, I got him at what would turn out to be near the end of his life. And he never really made it. You know, he was well thought of in certain circles, but financially, he never hit it. And this was a guy who was part of the great underground movement in San Francisco in the 60s. He was a Texas guy, but in the mid 60s, he went to San Francisco with Gilbert Shelton, who was a guy who did make it, and not a comic book person, but nevertheless part of that scene, Janis Joplin. I mean, these were his peers. And he never made it beyond what he described himself as a second stringer in that.
You know,
which
there are
is
people.
which is
Go
funny
ahead.
because a lot of people consider him as the first truly underground comic book artist.
Right. Well,
So
yeah, he made one. His comic book. You mean the book God Knows?
God knows, yeah,
Yes.
series of little underground comics about conversation between God and his creation,
Right.
which were actually pretty, pretty nice reads.
Right.
But wasn't Crumb part of that whole
Well,
gang?
no, absolutely, and but in the documentary, Jaxon describes how Crumb, at a certain point, just busts through the boundaries that had existed at that time, and got into violence and pornography in a major way, and the sense that I got was that Jaxon, although some of his work is pretty extreme, never was willing to go quite that far, and as such, he kind of remained, behind the lines, as it were. He never quite and then, of course, he made a decision, I think, in the late '60s to go back to Texas and work on his real love, which was Texas history. And when he did that, he just commercially went down the tubes, straight down.
Yeah, I mean the Venn diagram of people who care about underground comics and people who care about Texas history has just one occupant, and that's Jack Jaxon.
I mean, that's the problem. I mean, and he was a guy that was stubborn and unwilling to compromise in all kinds of ways. And I mean, you have to admire him. I mean, he was passionate about, his work is an expression of passion. But the price you pay for that is that you're a marginalized character.
Yeah.
And
So was the sexuality part of his work? Because it wasn't so overt in God Knows. So was the sexuality like his attempt to like bridge in the gap between history and that underground crowd that he felt that?
well, I mean, in he did one great work, which is kind of a work of like history fiction called The Secret of San Saba, which is kind of based, as I said, on historical ideas, but also a sort of science fiction kind of madness. And in that, there's all kinds of extreme types of rape and mutilation and so on. But and he in the film, he says the problem is that the people who are interested in porn aren't interested in history, and the people who are interested in history don't care about porn, and in fact would avoid it. So
I knew that was a good line. I stole it from somewhere. That's where I stole it from.
And his work, as he describes, fell in between the cracks.
But that's what interested me about the film, and that's why I thought it was a good pairing with Camarena, because when I ran across all that Mexican comic art, and then I started researching the history of Mexican comics, and then I realized that there was a whole generation of artists that basically had been plowed under by history, more or less.
What,
as an artist,
just left behind as things move on.
Well, yeah, and I think that it was a terrible time for the '70s were a terrible time in Mexico. Thanks to the United States, and that the thing that fills every artist with terror is the idea of being forgotten.
Really?
And it
Oh
fills
yeah.
me, it feels, I wonder, I see people rewriting my history without me in it all the time. And so getting you to finish this film and publishing this Camarena book is me banking karma for
No,
my
well,
own sake.
that was a great battle plan, because I have a feeling that the Jaxon material, which had laid dormant in some box for 10 years. What am I saying? Almost 20 years. Christ. Might never have found its way to being a finished narrative without you kind of creating this goal of, we've got to get to Angoulême. Because I remember it was like October of last year, we started editing, and we had to leave, in January. I know it sounds like a long time, except when you start translating it into French and putting subtitles on the film. I mean, there's just, anyway, it was a huge effort.
Yeah, especially I talked to you in May about doing it, and you waited until October.
We waited till October. Well, I don't think it was actually a reality that we were going. But anyway, it was. Most of the time, I don't work with deadlines. That's when you have a day job as a college professor, the world is something that goes on elsewhere. And which. That's just the way it is. And
I don't have that experience.
Well, that's my experience.
What experience? Working with deadlines?
Not working with deadlines.
Not working with deadlines.
No. I've worked on projects. The last one I finished, we spent 14 years working on it.
Wow.
Now, what happens is that I wind up working on several projects simultaneously, and I move from one to the other. But nevertheless, the last film that was actually finished and shown prior to Jaxon was 14 years from top to tail in the making. That sounds terribly indulgent, I'm sure, but you get to explore work in a different way, like. I understand that, people who actually have to make a living off their films, commercial filmmakers, are strapped by kind of different structures, and fair enough, but I'm not. And
so
we talked about this last night.
Yeah, last night we were having that conversation about, the lack of time being a great asset. So in your case, the lack of time being a great asset. What do you think about that?
The lack of time being a great, well, I'm saying that the Jaxon film, which was made under the pressure of a time frame pressure with a deadline, was a good experience.
Okay.
I'm not saying it isn't, but I have worked mostly in the last number of years in situations where there aren't deadlines, and there are problems with that. But at the same time, you do get to explore your subject matter in a different kind of way. And you get to, you produce something which is quite different than the normal time pressure stuff, I think. And it may not always be successful, but it's a great opportunity as an artist to really kind of explore in deep kind of ways work that might not otherwise be available. I mean, there are many ways to make art, many ways to make films. And, there's a kind of an arrogance about, certainly in the film area, of people who work via the industry standards, as it were. And I say, fuck them. I mean, I just, that's good for them. I've never met a professional filmmaker that I found particularly interesting, because I find that they're often enclosed and trapped by kind of, industry canons. And and what I kind of seek is the freedom to kind of discover alternate ways. And you spend 14 years on a project. I mean, there's an immersion there and a kind of an opportunity for meditation that just isn't there. When you've got, like the idea doesn't get an opportunity to evolve. If you have to make a pitch to a backer to make a film and they accept it, that film will be finished fairly soon. There's no time for anything to evolve and change. In fact, if you do change anything, they may withdraw their funds, because they've invested in a certain idea. All of these things I've been freed from. The Jaxon film, for example, I kind of shot that over 12 months, one night every month, filming the evolution of that comic book. Now, I'm not saying that that's impossible for a professional deal, but it's not an easy pitch. A 12-month, a 12-month project, and that's just the shooting, and then comes the post-production and so on. But I've been very fortunate to have the time to be able to experiment. When I was doing another film, I would break off to go and do that film. And it's a great freedom to be kind of working maybe on 3 or 4 different bits of business, and with no idea that any of them are going to necessarily lead anywhere.
Well,
but then maybe
you're working the way an artist works.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
I mean, that's what artists work in their studio with no, the good ones, with no expectation really of what's going to happen.
That's not how a lot of filmmakers work, I can assure you, because it's so expensive. They're confined to a much more kind of defined, well-defined route. That's why we talk about the film industry, and the idea of art in film is a very rare creature. And I feel that my situation has, as a college person, has given me that opportunity. Like I say, I'm not saying I'm better than the other people, but I'm sure it's held different.
So in that sense, I see a parallel between what you just said and Jaxon, right? Who kind of went off the trails to like do his thing his own way. Is that one of the things that kind of brought you guys together?
But it may have done, except the difference between us was he actually had to make a living out of his work. And it was a very humble living that he was scratching together. What he had done is he got together a consortium of some, as he called them, high rollers, people with a little extra cash. And those people invested in that comic book. He obviously presented the idea, and they said, okay. And every month he would get this pittance of a stipend from them, maybe $800 a month. And that's kind of because he had other kind of funds coming in, because he was disabled character and stuff like that, and his wife worked. So, but he was like on the edge. It was a struggle, to say the least.
But that's common with artists as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, good. Yeah. Okay, well then.
Especially in the comic book industry.
But last night we were talking about the what I see as the positive. I mean, the comic industry has never had a non-commercial. It doesn't have non-commercial roots. It has incredibly commercial roots.
Yeah.
And so the speed with which you have to work if you're a professional comic book artist or cartoonist is you don't have the luxury of years of contemplation. And that gives the work a certain kind of charm, I think, or a certain kind of urgency, because
although in comics, go ahead.
Well, it has a certain kind of urgency. That urgency has left now, I think. And there are
But-
more and more artists who spend, years working on a project before it sees the light of
But
day.
wouldn't you say there's always been that kind of back and forth between commercialism in comics and artists trying to do something more artistic or more research, more personal? I feel there's always been that vibe in comics, the back and forth between, oh, you have to produce, you have to mass produce, and oh, I'd like to produce something really personal.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's as varied as the people involved.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to think about them, but some artists come from money.
Sorry, they come from money?
Yeah, and so
I
they
see.
don't have the same set of conditions that everybody else
Sure.
has. It doesn't mean that they're bad artists because they come from money, but I don't like to think about them because how can you compete?
Well, I know the culture is sort of a meritocracy, or thinks it is, and so we like to celebrate, the humble soul who, by their wits and abilities, rise. And so the idea of somebody who is somehow a trust fund.
Yeah.
We're not interested in their stuff.
Well, that's what they keep it quiet. They don't talk about their money.
That's unless you want to include the president of the United States, who may not be a comic book artist, but he is a bit of a comic.
But he certainly is a comic book.
Now let's start talking about something serious.
He is not funny.
Why hasn't somebody done a comic book like Inside Trump's Brain?
There are a bunch of comic books about Trump.
About his brain?
Too many.
Oh, really?
Well, I mean,
he's a well-trodden
to me, Donald Trump is the single reason why Mad Magazine went bust.
Oh,
because with this guy, who needs Mad Magazine anymore?
The life has gone beyond the crazy kind of creations.
Exactly.
Did Mad Magazine go bust?
It did.
God.
Mad Magazine died a long time ago. Its zombie corpse finally stopped twitching. It was bought by Time Warner decades ago, and
destroyed.
Although I had friends that did some stuff with Mad Magazine. I mean, if you were a certain kind of person, Mad Magazine is a very important cultural touchstone. And so, who wouldn't want to work for the thing that they admire the most in the world?
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end, it kind of became irrelevant, right? Because you had one village idiot per village, but it seemed that nowadays, you'll only find like one person out of a village of idiots. So Mad Magazine was time and it had succeeded.
We've got some questions coming in on the chat from the YouTube. So I'm going to pull up one of those people that we actually have 4 concurrent viewers right now.
Okay.
And there's a question about whoever this is knows me really well, because they said buy my comic or I'll shoot this dog.
You've got shills in the audience, I think.
I don't know who this is, but they're clearly some sort of shadow.
They're in the
shadow conspiracy.
No.
But the point that Callie 1313 makes, this is our viewer, is that if the film system was a meritocracy, all the famous actors wouldn't have famous parents.
Right. It sounds good to me. I'm just saying that the culture pretends that it's a meritocracy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think that's why people are burning everything this week. Is the illusion of the meritocracy is over now. It's being cleansed by fire.
It is. Really.
Well, was it an
well,
illusion though? Was it an illusion though?
No, they promote it. You know, the idea of a meritocracy is the thing that they use to keep other people out.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to keep. If you're not my friend, then you didn't really earn whatever it is. And you know, the comic book world is filled with this illusion of meritocracy, right? These cliques that manipulate circumstances and manipulate who appears and who doesn't appear at any particular moment.
But I mean, it's a trap, right? To keep people in the system, right?
Well, yeah.
So if you work hard, if you do this and that, you'll be able to.
You're right.
Except
it's the myth of upward mobility.
Exactly.
It keeps that stoked. Whereas the reality is that there's a vast labor pool which capitalism demands, and those people aren't rising out of that. They're going to flip burgers for the rest of their days.
Mm.
Well, up until they can't flip them fast enough, then they're out.
They're out.
Well, then they become burgers. Soylent Green.
Soylent Green. Oh, are we having a Soylent Green moment? Right up my alley. Soylent Green.
I think this is the third Soylent Green conversation I've had this week.
Really? Lucky you.
It definitely is the third Soylent Green conversation.
Is it?
Cannibalism is on the rise. You know.
Well,
we're consuming ourselves. The cities are on fire.
Yeah. I think that's the only thing left to consume, actually, is ourselves.
That's it.
Well, you know, I was thinking Angoulême happened right at the end of January, and we got out of there just in time. You know, just a few days later, the
cannibalism started.
The virus kind of exploded.
Exploded.
I think we're lucky to be alive.
God.
Yeah. I mean, you know, a week later, I was in Australia, and it was so hot down there that I don't think any virus can humanely survive in heat like that. So I guess we were lucky to get out. And if I had caught anything, it would have died in the sun of Australia, of beautiful Townsville, Queensland, Australia. So yeah,
it's pretty hot in Houston, and we've got plenty of disease down here. So I don't know if your theory quite works out.
No, you don't. You just have to cook the numbers a bit.
There you go. So, you know, I keep trying to go back to talking about comics instead of talking about politics, but I don't know if it's really worthwhile going back to talking about comics.
Yes, comics is better. It's a better subject.
Well, let's do
the parallels between Jaxon and Camarena, which I think is the part that's really fascinating to me.
Well, it's something that we never really get to. We didn't get to it in the panel at Angoulême, and so yeah, this is the perfect venue. I mean, they were contemporaries, right? They basically Camarena's in his 80s now, and Brian, how old was Jack when he died?
Yeah, in his 60s.
Yeah, so he would have been in his late 80s now. So they were contemporaries, you know, in different countries.
I get it. Yeah.
Both started working in the 60s.
And also, Jaxon had a real interest in Mexico.
Oh, of course, Texas history is bound with
yeah,
Mexican history.
but a lot of Texas historians never crossed the border. And he went many times to study in the archives there, and knew various scholars and people. So even though he was, Jaxon was a more complex figure. He was a comic book artist, but he was also a conventional historian who produced conventional books. So
yeah, he studied at University of Texas, right?
well, that doesn't mean anything.
Well, I mean, he's college educated. That's still a thing,
Of course.
And what did he study at UT? Did he study history?
No, he was convinced by advisors to become an accountant, because even though he wanted to be an artist, he told them you needed to have a kind of a certain career where you could make a living, So he became an accountant, and he did that for a while before he went the whole hog for his art.
Yeah. And so it's conceivable that Jaxon was familiar with Mexican comic art and Mexican comic books.
I have to say that we never talked. Unfortunately, our conversations never went in that direction. But
I'm absolutely sure that he would have known what they were. But I don't know if there are any more parallels between the two artists, because Camarena,
to me, the parallels are like in the 70s. So Jaxon left San Francisco late 60s, early 70s to go back to Texas.
Right.
And in the 70s, basically, Camarena's world kind of ended with the kind of transition period that the historietas kind of went through in the 70s, with like the whole political and economic strife that happened in Mexico during the 70s, and the kind of the loss of that culture that they had in Mexico of comics. To me, there's a great parallel there. Even the fact, I mean, Camarena is still alive, but his career is pretty much dead. Whereas
he retired. He retired.
Yeah. And Jaxon, although dead, his career is pretty much alive. So, I think there's strange parallels that you can
No, I mean, I think that it's too bad that Jaxon isn't alive to see this, because I think that he would be, Texas Mexico history is his thing, and this Camarena book is Mexican history. I mean, it's 60 years ago, not 160 years ago, but nonetheless, I think it's something that would have been interesting to him. Camarena had no little formal education, and he worked as an apprentice in drawing. He worked in a factory during the day, and then at night worked for another artist, sort of sharpening his pencils and whatever.
But there was a rich graphic art tradition in Mexico, right? In the beginning of like the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. Like comic books were really, who were the two comics historians who said like Mexico and Japan were like the hub of comics in the world?
Are you asking me? It's not a rhetorical question.
I'm asking you.
I don't know who you're.
I don't remember their names. They wrote extensively about Mexican comics, and like if you're looking for the numbers of readership and so on and so forth, in Mexican comics, these two guys like were the go-to guys. I think at some point, like every Mexican were reading like 3 comic books a day. Like these things were printed like crazy numbers of comics, like a month, like 30 million or something a month. So
55 million.
Yeah,
By the
55 million.
mid-70s, they were printing 55 million.
Yeah.
So the comics were bigger than everything except radio in Mexico at that time.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that Camarena came from like a rich history of comics. And to me, it seems like Jaxon also came from like, you know, a rich history of underground comics, but also a rich history of comics. And
right, but Jaxon, it seems to me, I mean, my memory of talking with him over all those long nights was his constant reminding me of how hard it was to make a living. And I'm wondering the Camarena, is that his name? Camarena?
Yeah.
Did he also have a difficult time financially? I mean,
well, they were paid very little, the Mexican comic book artists, and they had to work quite significantly. But he was actually paid better than a lot of his contemporaries, and he had very steady work. A lot of what he did was a lot of what he did just really outstripped his contemporaries.
Mm-hmm. But it sounded like there was a structure, an industry that his work fitted into and had distribution, presumably, and all of that stuff handled.
There were 26 different publishers at that time, 26 different comic book publishers.
Mm.
So it seems like a much richer, more fertile area to be working in as a comic book artist than the sense I get in the United States for an independent. Like I think Jaxon actually founded a press. Was it Last Gasp? Rip-Off Press.
Yeah. With
so he actually had to create the whole operation,
Yeah, but I mean, in the sense that these guys went to San Francisco in the 60s and got to experiment and got to really let loose and create all types of, comics. And to me, that's what I'm talking about like coming from a rich, experience in comics, because not anybody, to me, not everybody got to experience like that, San Francisco in the 60s, creating and, partying and hanging out with other amazing creators. So in that sense,
I mean, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of Jaxon actually describing that period of his life very much in those terms.
Yeah.
And I think his problem was that period ended, and it was full of so much promise in terms of artistic production and so on, that I think he felt personally betrayed by, but in particular, in Austin, there was a free press there. And he felt that the free press, had a commitment to support artists and include their work and so forth. And what the free press wound up doing in the 70s and 80s was making money off personal ads, porno ads and stuff like that. And
do we know
lost
why
their way? I think Jaxon felt that the culture lost its way. Now maybe he was foolish, but I mean, I think that's it. And he was still committed to the high ideals in the sense that he associated with the 60s, where there was a commitment to art and through art creating a great society.
But that generation sold out. The 60s generation became the Gordon Geckos of the 80s.
That's what he ran into when you know, that local Austin Free Press did a review of his comic book, The Lost Cause, and accused Jaxon of being a racist, and then wouldn't allow him an opportunity to kind of respond to it.
And you know, that created a
He was
huge
doubly
stain on
betrayed.
Jackson's reputation.
Pardon?
I said that created a huge stain on Jackson's reputation.
Absolutely.
I mean, he was, and you know, yeah, I think
Well, it's because
not giving him equal time was the dick move. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know.
it was unfortunate. I mean, and of course, Jaxon may have opened himself up to that criticism, but the point was, as an artist, he was free to explore. He
But I
felt,
mean,
and what
so-
he did was he ranged into areas that are now clamped down on by political correctness. And he attempted a strategy of storytelling about a racist section of our past, where
I think it was more of a thing that, you know, putting reality in the face of people in a way that's so shocking that people need to, oh, this person is racist. But like I remember when I was a kid, there was this guy called Jimmy the Greek. He was a boxing announcer. And I remember him saying once that, you know, oh, you know, black people in America are like genetically engineering, and no wonder they're better at boxing. And I remember him getting all kinds of stuff from everybody saying how he was a racist and whatever. But for us, you know, upper middle class family, we were like, we didn't get why people were so, you know, enraged by his comment, because it was the truth, you know. And I think people just got reality put up in their faces and just couldn't deal with it, you know. And oh, you're a racist. Well, actually, no, it's the truth, you know. And that comment was brutally honest. But does that make Jaxon a racist? I you know, I can't say that. Well, especially in these times we live in, I cannot say that.
Well, the tragedy is that rather than that being an opening for discussion and exploration of the hottest topic in American history, which is racism, it is the
exactly.
Instead of using that as an opportunity to explore that, they just the attitude was of the reviewer, this is a crappy comic book. Comic books are crap. And the content of this is double crap. And that's the end of that. They just sort of threw it out. They threw Jaxon out. They threw the book out. They threw an opportunity to explore a major theme in American history. I mean, and I think comic books, in the sense, are often kind of handled in that way. They're marginalized and considered, you know, unimportant, as the 60s books were just considered sex books, fuck books, or whatever.
Look, the most important topic in American history is capitalism. It's not racism.
Well, then racism is
They're both the same.
Of capitalism.
They're both the same.
There you go. That's it. Of course, it's right. Of course,
it's capital.
It's
capitalism.
Look what's going on out in the streets today. Is that capital? That's race.
Yeah, no, that's capitalism.
Yeah,
that is capitalism.
Yeah, but you're a college professor now. You see, you're disconnecting from the moment.
No, because slaves were commodity.
Just
right?
like water.
At their root.
Yeah,
at their root, racism.
But I mean,
racism
in capitalism,
they accepted it. They accepted
everybody's
it. Never rebelled. They accepted it. Never rebelled, because, you know, God created them. What was it? 3/5.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, there you go. 3/5.
Yeah,
3/5. You know, history of capitalism.
Shit.
Fuckers.
Well, that guy with his knee.
It was the Dutch.
That guy in the knee and the neck of that black guy who's dying underneath it. I don't think we're thinking capitalism when we're looking at that picture.
I do.
No, but I
The
mean,
police are there
if you
to
look at,
defend the property.
We're looking at a brutal thug
yeah,
who
but
is empowered
that's the
by
history.
a corrupt system, maybe.
That's the history of police in the United States, at least. The police force in the United States has its rules, and the people who were sent to recover slaves.
That's right.
So no, it's
Slave
it's
catchers, right?
yeah, so that mentality just never left. Again,
I know, because they're property, and that's
their
back to the
property,
capitalist thing.
and it goes back exactly.
God, that's right. The psychosis of this country is that these people can't give up the fact they lost all their property in 1863. It's just sort of terrible.
Anyways,
There's a really interesting 3-part sort of docudrama about Ulysses Grant on the History Channel.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's really nicely made. I think it combines historians talking about Grant and then dramatic recreations. But the casting is really good, except for Lincoln. I don't like the guy they cast as Lincoln, but it's very kind of grittily made dramatic recreations of Civil War battles. And
does the History Channel have any sense of history left in that thing? Ever since what's his name bought it?
Yeah.
What's that douchebag's name again?
Elon Musk. Is he the one who bought the History Channel?
No, the Australian guy.
Murdoch?
Owner of
Murdoch. Does he own
Yes.
the History Channel?
He owns History Channel,
he knows
Discovery Channel, and all these amazing.
Well, how come he's still alive? He's so old. I mean,
he feeds on
he feeds on Jerry
newborn babies.
Talk about vampires.
Newborns.
We've got about 5 minutes left in this nonsense, this wide-ranging intellectual discussion about Rupert Murdoch.
Be careful what you call nonsense. Who knows what will
more Camarena. More Camarena.
I recommend.
Come on, Chris.
I recommend more Camarena. I recommend more History Channel.
I recommend less History Channel, more Camarena.
So the thing that I love about this Camarena book, and I'm just going through the slides. The thing I love about this Camarena book, and I love about comics in general, is I love this the facsimile book. And I don't know if you've seen any of these, either of you. Have either of you seen a lot of these facsimile books?
What are you mean reproductions of original?
So it's a reproduction of the original art, but where you can see the
page.
Where the artist has penciled or
has
glued in, or penciled or glued in, or
literally going back to the original kind of elements.
Yeah. And so the hilarious thing is that, of course, the Camarena originals are so tiny, right? Usually these facsimile books are massive, but the Camarena originals are only about 8 inches tall.
Is that book? Does that reproduce the actual size?
Yeah, it's actual size.
Well, they're designed to be able to held in one hand. So when you sit in the outhouse, you have your other hand free.
Well, the comics were small because it was cheaper to make them small, and had the knock-on benefit of being able to fit in your pocket, so you could
pocket.
take a little break at work and
Yes.
read your scandalous little rag.
While you're eating or some other
Yeah.
activity. Right.
Yeah. So
Well, this is great. I'm so pleased that you made the effort to kind of get this little YouTube thing going this evening. It's such, as you said, the artists seek immortality in one way or another, and so this is a little opportunity to kind of inject a little hope and life into Jaxon and Camarena, who have, in a sense, come and gone in terms of the great kind of world of production, but so much production just ends up in the trash heap of history, and it's the great ones who reach back and pull certain items out and say, not so fast, not so fast.
Yeah.
Let's look at this again.
Isn't Fantagraphics working on bringing a lot of the old Jaxon?
Yeah, they've already reprinted some of his Texas stuff, and I think they're going again at some point with like the Alamo comic book that I made the film about, that they're going to I think re-release that.
Yeah, hopefully they'll change the cover.
That fucking cover, that's right. Just Jaxon was just sort of impossible. Are we still going? Okay,
yeah.
Yes. I mean, his passion betrayed him with his selection of the cover art. I mean, that's. I guess we're all in agreement on that. But now, Chris,
totally.
do you feel that Jackson's choice of cover art was actually nodding his head towards commercialism, trying to kind of help sell the comic? But to me, I mean, it seems it would have quite the reverse. Okay. I would pass by those covers.
Well, I think that he, clearly Jaxon didn't really have a good idea about marketing his own material.
Yeah.
Right, because he made big boobied women for the Daughters of the American Revolution.
That's right.
Whatever, he didn't.
That's a funny story,
But what Jaxon needed was a manager, right? He needed an editor or a manager who could
like every good artist,
impossible,
keep him out of making a bunch of bad decisions.
I mean, he couldn't be managed, because when I started over a year, our relationship changed a bit, and I got more relaxed with him, and on occasion attempted sort of minor criticism or suggestions about the work he was on, and it was like butt out. I mean, he iced over at any attempt to kind of impose upon what he was doing. He was truly an isolated individual when it came to his work.
Well, I think we should sum up. We've got just like a minute to go. But, I think what's a shame about the virus is that we had planned to do the North American premiere of the film at TCAF, at the Toronto Comics Arts Festival. That was our plan. That was our hope. They were up for that, I think. And,
Chris was up.
And we were gonna.
And we would have been so much better live.
Well, people could at least throw shit at us if we were going on too long. But so, my hope is that folks will have us back next year, and we'll just the world has waited 20 years for the North American premiere of the Jaxon film.
Jackson's
Rant.
Jackson's Rant.
I know the title. I made the poster. I know the title.
Show the poster
It's a good poster.
That's not.
That's not the poster.
That's not there.
There you go.
It's a good poster.
Great. Why
Good
didn't you
poster.
sign it?
You know, I'm a humble man. I don't need my name on everything.
It kind of worries me that you didn't sign it. Like you don't have real respect for it.
No, I love it. I think it's terrific. I like to look at it. I think that I'm very talented. And with that, we're out of time.
We're out of
Thank you.
time.
Thank you for joining us. And I hope that
Yeah.
you'll
People should check out Argle Bargle to see if we are crazy enough to do another one of those things.
arglebarglebooks.com,
.com.
cats.rice.edu. And I'm Chris Brandio, and for Stan Waney and Brian Huberman, good night.